Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing very well. Good to see you. And I'd like to talk about Syria. And there's another event going on, something that specifically hasn't been talked about too much, but it's been going on for a good while. And that has to do with an enclave near Damascus, East Ghouta. And it's an enclave which is made up of a lot of radical jihadists that been trying to support the people who want to get rid of Assad. But it looks like Assad is about to throw him out along with his allies. I'm sure Assad's allies are also helping him. But because it looks like it might fail, all of a sudden there's major articles now of how horrible, how bad it is. Sort of like what we heard when the fall of Aleppo was occurring, where Assad was recapturing that city and throwing out, the rebels. So, but the news now comes out, and a press release by the United Nations, they come out and they're talking about how horrible it is and why is this happening. Of course, it's all Assad's fault, and they don't explain it. And that is not to defend, Assad as a saint, obviously.
Yeah.
But under the circumstances, this is a really mixed bag. They did the same thing in Aleppo, and guess what? Afterwards, they realized that the people were delighted. And once Assad had control of Aleppo, 600,000 people came back in, and that's what they wanted, a little bit of stability. This is the same thing, but it's getting hot and heavy, and so now the articles are out. The UN said it's so bad there, they're killing children. Like, we've never been engaged in killing children, that they're killing children. And they said it was so bad in their press release, just left a paragraph blank because they couldn't stand describing what was going on. And I think that's a bit of hyperbole about this whole thing, about all of a sudden the UN are saints, and they're the ones who are going to describe the moral case for protecting and getting rid of Assad efforts to, take back Ghouta.
And there's no question that it is a horrible situation. These people are under siege. There are, I think, about 300,000 or 400,000 people under siege there. The region has been held by, as you point out, about 5 different rebel groups. The people have been held hostage, and there is a lot of shelling, and there are people dying, there are civilians dying, and it is horrible. But this UN thing was a propaganda stunt, really, and it really is taking sides, because you didn't see where was the UN, for example, in Raqqa when the U.S. bombed the place to the smithereens? They say at least 1,800 civilians were killed. What about in Mosul, where the U.S. also blasted that to smithereens? They say up to 11,000 civilians were killed there. It's terrible. But when the U.S. is behind it, it's, this is great, we've got to liberate it. But when the designated enemy is behind it, even if the people holding it and holding these people hostage are objectively bad guys, it's just a shame to see the UN, and not surprising to see the UN use this kind of tactic.
Yeah, it brings up a lot of thoughts on my part about the UN. I can remember back so far, even when I was in 8th grade, I can remember my school teachers, probably 1948, coming in and sort of bragging about the UN and how marvelous they would be. And for a long time, a lot of people believed that. There wasn't even strong opposition. But a lot of people knew from the very beginning that the UN was all about world government. It wasn't about peace, and so far we see that to be the case. And also, so remember a few years after that teacher was talking about the United Nations, it was the UN that made the decision for us to go to war. And we didn't go to war in the usual way of declaring war. We went into that, and we're still in a mess in Korea. So the UN doesn't serve much of a useful purpose. They have all these fancy units. They're supposed to care, for education and feed the children and all that. Well, they haven't done anything. And all they're doing is picking sides and making the matters worse.
And we see now, if you remember back in 2014, that intercepted phone call in the Ukraine situation, between the U.S. ambassador and Nuland, Victoria Nuland, where they were talking about the coup. Remember what they said? They said, we got to get Jeff Feltman, who was a U.S. diplomat, but then went over to the UN to work. We got to get Jeff Feltman on the line and get the UN to put some glue on this. You know, it's essentially what they're saying. So they were colluding, I guess is the current term, colluding with the UN to do an overthrow of the government in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And you know, no matter what they're saying and how bad it is, maybe it will work out in spite of all the tragedy going on, as well as Aleppo did, because Aleppo now is a much more peaceful city, and they've all moved back in. There's no bombing, and the city was really, really destroyed. I imagine there's some rebuilding going on. So it's a terrible way to try to improve things, but right now, if those who are determined and obsessed with nothing can exist until we destroy the whole concept of Syria, and we talked about that yesterday on who owns Syria right now, and getting rid of Assad, this battle could turn out to be, a significant battle. In that this is close to Damascus. It's one area Assad's going to secure, one significant area of Syria, and this might be a shift. But it just does put more determinations indirectly. People who are cheering this on are neocons who are always prompting support, whether it's United Nations or whether it's our senators or whatever. And the media, the deep state is involved along with the neocons, and nobody would want to think that there's ever a different side. Certainly, the UN is much more noble than a guy like Assad.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that the media doesn't report is that these rebels in East Ghouta are using that area as a staging ground to fire missiles into Damascus, the city. As a matter of fact, yesterday, the head of the Damascus Opera was killed by a mortar fired from these rebels. But the other thing you don't hear about is who are these rebels? They say rebels, a tiny amount of them are affiliated with Al-Qaeda. So I went looking, who are these groups? And I found Deutsche Welle, which is funded by the German government, our ally. It's hardly a radical publication. It's very much in tune like the U.S. Voice of America. And they had here's the 5 groups fighting, and here's their affiliation: Jaish al-Islam, Islamic terror group. They want Sharia law. Falak al-Rahman, U.S. armed group. They're allied with Tahrir al-Sham. Well, who are they? They're a Syrian version of Al-Qaeda. That's the 3rd group, Tahrir al-Sham. Number 4 is Al-Zenki, another U.S.-backed jihadist group. They're the ones, if you remember, who beheaded that 15-year-old boy on video. And then the final one is Harakat Ahrar al-Sham al-Islamiyya. I'm sorry, I don't pronounce it well. They're fighting to form an Islamic state under Sharia law, and they're allied with Al-Zenki, the head choppers. So these are the groups that we're really talking about. All Islamic terrorist groups. They're the ones that control this area. Why doesn't the media talk about this?
And obviously it is a charade that you say, because if they had cared about children, they might have expressed a little bit of concern about how many children died from our bombing and sanctions in Iraq, when it was admitted by Albright that 500,000 kids probably died from destroying their infrastructure and the sanctions that went on. But what about what's going on currently now with our weaponry and our ally Saudi Arabia and Yemen?
Yeah.
I mean, that is atrocious. I imagine what's happening in Yemen is hundreds of times more violent and killing many, many more people than what's going now, in Gaza.
And all death is horrible, but they're also slow, cruel deaths. People are dying of cholera. They're dying of all of these illnesses. They're dying of starvation. Most people should have seen the pictures of starving people there. Hundreds of thousands of people, millions even, on the verge of starvation. There's no UN blank pages being issued for these people either, because the U.S. is providing the weapons and the intelligence, and our allies, Saudis, are doing the bombing.
The question I get frequently from supporters when I'm on the road will be, but what if you have an instance where there's one country and it's a corrupt government and a lot of people are suffering and it's a bad situation? Don't we have a moral obligation to go in there and help them? And I tell them, no, we don't. If you feel morally compelled to help them, you can do it. But I do not believe if I were in government or take a position, have the authority, should I promote the policy of saying what we need to do is send our troops, our people up, take money from people and send them over there and solve those internal problems. For a couple of reasons. I think it was morally wrong, and second, it never works. I mean, especially when the government does it. But that's the hardest thing for people to understand. But the other thing that I emphasize that seems to help neutralize the answer is that so often there's a prohibition against it. We can't act in that way and go into these zones. And there's a lot of private money that may well do that, and they can help. People can still help. You can still have a moral position, but you can't impose the decision to expose people's life and money by a government extracting that and saying, we're going to take care of it. And that's what the UN is all about. I mean, it's talk, but no action. There's no results. I would think that the UN has, you'd have to search hard for some really successes. They've had to have had some successes over all these years, but that isn't the case. It's a tool of authoritarianism is what it is from the very beginning. And even when you go to the next step in a branch of the UN is like the WTO. They don't create free trade. They promote that for the benefit of some big corporation. And a lot of this is big corporations, the media, and the military-industrial complex, and all this. And then oil is a big issue. That's what's behind a lot of this. But no, they're going to turn it in to this thing. This is horrible, horrible, horrible. We can't let it happen. So therefore, they're struggling now to try to get more people engaged in getting rid of Assad before he takes back one of this particular part of Damascus.
And the other reason why you say, well, shouldn't we go in there and do something? Don't we have to? One of the other reasons why we can't and shouldn't is because we don't have full information. Propaganda rules the roost when it comes to this. And there's even a great film that was made about the Libya situation where the head of the Libyan NGO, foreign-funded NGO, who was the one behind getting this UN Human Rights Council to condemn Gaddafi, he admitted on camera that he lied about what was happening there. So that's the other reason. We don't know what's going on in these countries. We don't know if it's a lie, if it's war propaganda, throwing babies from incubators sort of thing. So that's the other reason. And usually when we do go in, we make things worse.
Yeah, and the reality is, if they don't think if they would have trouble getting in there, they don't go in. If they think somebody like Saddam Hussein had a weapon, they're going to be hesitant. If they know he doesn't, if he gives it up, like Gaddafi and this sort of thing. So it's what they can do. But when people are able to defend themselves, we back off. So it's a power struggle. It has nothing to do with their concern for how many people are dying and about the children and the suffering, or we wouldn't be doing this. Sanctions are always an attack on the people themselves, when it has to do with drugs and medications and all these things that so often it's the children that suffer from the sanctions, and sanctions are so popular in Washington. Oh, we don't have to send our troops in there. Nobody's going to die. But those people don't count. They're the bad people, and that'll bring the leader to their knees. It doesn't. It solidifies if they have a corrupt leader or not a saint as leader, what you do, the opposition just has to melt away because the outsiders are coming in to try to destroy them, and it unifies and undermines the people who are internally trying to get rid of a bad guy.
And speaking of the sanctions, remember how Jacob Hornberger said at our conference last, told us a story about the fellow in Washington who tried to send some medicine to Iraq when the children were suffering under sanctions. The U.S. government arrested him, prosecuted him. But, we often criticize Donald Trump, but I want to praise Donald Trump for a change today. And I have a tweet. He's a big tweeter, as you know, Dr. Paul. I have a tweet from Donald Trump that I want to praise. I think it's great. It's something he did in 2013, and I guess we don't have it. But what he said is, he told Obama, "You better stay the heck out of Syria. If you want to go into Syria, you're going to need congressional authorization." And here we are. We're talking about how we control 30% of Syria, we own Syria. So now here's the tweet. What do we get for bombing Syria besides more dead and possible long-term
Conflict.
Obama needs congressional approval. 2013, that was a different Trump.
Oh boy. Well, it's just too bad that we can't do better. Because I think logic is on our side. I think national sovereignty is on our side. And yet we don't seem to be winning this. The propagandists are so powerful. But I still want to remain optimistic that ideas have consequences. You don't have to have a 51% minorities if they're irate and keen on telling the truth, that you can win out in the end. But it's a struggle because sometimes it takes a lot of time. But I do believe that the majority of the people of the world, especially the ones who have to die, would just as soon not have these wars. Now, even the people who promote the wars, oh no, we don't want war, but they always claim they don't want war, and they do all the things that they want war, they want peace on their terms. And that's the big difference. I think people have to be a little more tolerant of individuals as well as individual countries to live their lives even with their imperfections, rather than to say that we are going to make them perfect and they're going to do it our way and we will spread our American goodness. Bad thing to do, bad sign. It's been failing. So it's time for us to concentrate on making America, an example so other people might follow us, and they do it in a peaceful manner. That's the only way it can be done. And there's no reason why people can't understand it. Liberty is not complex, and once an individual understands this, that is the sole way you can move toward peace and prosperity, and it's based on just non-aggression. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.